Today we're going to talk about what we can do about it, and it's not really the weather, it's climate, but it's a good quote. So, and actually he didn't say that, he plagiarized it. So this is HEAL. A few more things about us is that we have about 20,000 supporters in the state in our database. We have about a $500,000 annual budget, which is about half foundation grants and half supporter donations. There's actually 6.5 of us, and we have a 10-member board, and we also have some sort of on retainer content expert advisors when we get into highly technical stuff. That's about me, which I've already talked about. That's Donald Trump and my grandkids. So we're going to talk about policy solutions. And to start with, when we talk about climate change, we talk about carbon dioxide, but there's actually several greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. So carbon dioxide is certainly the most commonly present in the atmosphere. And it's sort of the reference case, the baseline of climate change effects. And then as you go through, methane is 25 times more, has more impact on climate change than carbon dioxide. And nitrous oxides are almost 300 times. And then you get to the refrigerants, chlorofluorocarbons, which are 100 times more potent, and hydrofluorocarbons, which are 270 times more potent, but are present in much less concentration in the atmosphere because their potency, they're sort of they're as important as carbon dioxide, and they also persist longer. And then you get down into some of these smaller ones that persist even longer. But so when people talk about greenhouse gases, they're not just talking about carbon dioxide, they're talking about this. And I know that there have been several lectures in this series, and I wasn't unfortunately able to come to any of them. And so I'm just going to go through a quick review to make sure we're on the same page, but I don't want to bore you. I'm sure many of you know this. So this is the distribution of where the carbon dioxide emissions come from. This is going to become important later when we talk about it, but this is China and the United States, the rest of the world, and then you can sort of see what happens kind of in a lot of the smaller developing countries. But in terms of the lion's share, it's China and the United States. People often talk about India too, and it's 7%. This shows the per capita carbon dioxide emissions around the world. So even though we're smaller than China, our per capita emissions are much larger than China. So our lifestyles generate more carbon dioxide, and then you can sort of see going down these countries. And this is the mean emission per capita for the countries that are part of the Organization of Economic and Community Development nations. And then this is sort of the mean per capita emissions across the globe. This shows what sectors carbon dioxide is emitted from. Power was the top emitter, and as renewables have becoming more common, it's dropped below. Transportation is now the most responsible for the most carbon dioxide, and then you can see where industry and the buildings that we use fit in, which sort of are the major four sectors. So, you know, I don't probably have to convince you of this, but there's a lot of talk, well, the climate has always been changing, and yes, it always has been changing, but this is the 400,000-year record, and this has never happened before, and there's just not much debate about that. And so, and the thing about this chart, I heard Paul Hawken speak up at Park City, and the projections are the best modeling we have, but we've never been at this point before. We don't really know exactly what's going to happen. We're modeling it the best we can, but we can't go back and say, well, this is what happens because we've seen it happen before. We don't know. We really don't know. It could accelerate faster, or it could stabilize. We just don't know for sure. But the models tell us, and the models are as good as we can predict, that things could get a lot worse. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a UN body that studies this, and their last report was in 2013. Their next report's due in 2020. And what they do is they propose representative concentration pathways. So the blue line at the top is sort of the worst case scenario. if we don't really do anything differently. And then the other lines show, based on different sort of speed and intensity of changes, what we can do. And even in the best case scenario, which is the RCP 2.6, we're still going to stay at about 400 parts per million, which is where we started when we really shot up. If we go back here, so this is where we were in 2015. So this was sort of the high point historically. We're now at 400, and even if we do the most aggressive interventions, we're going to stay at about 400 is the modeling. And these show the sort of confidence intervals around these numbers. The next one shows them better. So this shows with 3 of those scenarios what's going to happen to the temperature. So in Celsius, if we go with the 2.6 RCP, we're still going to be about 1 degree warmer Celsius globally than we were before we got into this situation. And then you can see by the time we get up to the RCP 8.5, which is the worst case scenario, we're at 4 degrees Celsius, which is about 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average, which creates major disruption of a lot of systems, and you all know this, so we'll just keep going. And then this just shows the number of models that went into each of these RCPs, just so you know that this isn't just like one projection. So in the RCP 2.6, for the projection between 2000 and 2100, there were 32 different models that were generated, and that's where you get the noise here, the confidence intervals around those projections. So this is highly rigorous scientific work with the best information that we have, and it's the information we have to act on because it's the best we have. So this series is about health impacts. There's a lot of different ways of presenting this. This is the one that the New England Journal of Medicine had a while ago. This is the one that I think comes from the Climate Nexus, yeah. And so it's a little bit climate pressures, the sort of antecedents, what the exposure pathways are, what the health outcomes are in different organ systems. And then this poor woman who's feeling panicky about the whole thing. And then this is what I call, this was in the Lancet thing that was the base of this. This is what I call the Krebs cycle of climate change health impacts, because it's so complicated that it's sort of like having to remember that for those of us who had to take that test and then forgot about it a little while later. But they all come basically to agreement that there's going to be vector diseases, respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, mental health, and heat-related illness, and we're already seeing it. So, scientific consensus is this is a bad disease with a bad prognosis. What might be effective? What can we do about it? First, though, let's talk about whether this kind of change, societal, cultural, political change, is even possible. Is this really something that we can expect to even do, or are we just sort of flapping in the wind here? Well, there is some case studies. So, acid rain, some of you are old enough to remember acid rain, and it was destroying the forests and acidifying the lakes and streams. And that was primarily due from sulfur dioxide that was emitted from coal power plants. And there were very high levels of sulfur dioxides emitted from coal power plants then. So in the 1990 Clean Air Act, there was added into that act a cap and trade policy for sulfur dioxides. It wasn't regulated in that everyone had to get to this level. It was, we're going to give sulfur dioxide credits, and you can trade and sell them, and so that policy, which is similar to what's been proposed for carbon, cap and trade, resulted in sulfur dioxide emissions dropping faster and cheaper than was predicted. So this was a major global problem. There was the United States, and there were other countries who did this too, came up with this policy, and basically we don't really talk about acid rain anymore because sulfur dioxide has dropped so rapidly that it's a small fraction of what it was when this first happened. Second one is the hole in the ozone. So you've all heard about this, the thinning of the ozone over the Antarctic during the spring. And the cause of this was the release of chlorofluorocarbons, which were the main refrigerants used in air conditioning, refrigeration, cars, aerosol sprays. And they persist for decades in the atmosphere, and they chemically react with ozone and pull those oxygen molecules away from the ozone and break it down. And there was prediction, these models that are like the climate models, that the whole ozone layer, which protects us from ultraviolet rays, and would have collapsed by 2050 if we hadn't done anything. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol was entered into by every nation in the United Nations, and now the hole in the ozone now is smallest it's been in 30 years, and they think that within the next 30, 40 years that it will completely return to its normal level. So these are major societal changes, industrial societal changes, that have solved environmental problems through policies that have been cooperative around the world. So there's reason to believe that it's possible for us to come together and do something similar around carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. There's a number of organizations that have developed lists of what should be done, and you can Google this and you'll find dozens of them. This is an example. The Environmental Defense Fund has come up with their list, and it sort of relates to the things that we've talked about. You know, China as a sort of get your arms around what China's doing. And then the carbon cap and trade, carbon market changes, renewable energy, stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. And then this is the refrigerant one. So that we get back to refrigerants, which was a greenhouse gas on my first slide. This is what replaced chlorofluorocarbons when the Montreal Protocol went in. They started using hydrogen fluorocarbons. And they are a greenhouse gas, and a very, very potent greenhouse gas. So the solution to one problem has caused a problem for another. Methane leaks is important because methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and methane leaks are very common, especially out in the Uinta Basin. The detection system out there shows that most of those wells are leaking methane. There's another one so Paul Hawken, who was the founder of Smith & Hawken, is now a billionaire. And a lot of these guys, like Bill Gates, once they make as much money as you can possibly make, they decide to focus on global problems. And so Paul Hawken, for the last 10 years, has been focused on climate change. And he's assembled these researchers to model what are the most productive interventions that we can focus on, both from an effectiveness and an economic point of view. And he's very positive that we can do what's necessary to solve this problem. So the number one solution, which when he presented this, he said he was really disappointed that this came out as number one because it's not a very sexy thing to talk about, refrigerant management. So interestingly enough, we talked about hydrofluorocarbons being a greenhouse gas. Well, the Montreal Protocol phased out chlorofluorocarbons, and now there's been an amendment to the Montreal Protocol that 72 countries have agreed to phase out hydrofluorocarbons over the next 30 years. And the United States has not signed on to this treaty. We've not ratified. President Trump refuses to submit it to the Senate for ratification. So this is probably one of the most important interventions in climate change that nobody knows about, is advocating for the U.S. to ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. Well, the list that Hawken and his team came up with shows there's 100 things. This is just the first 10. And wind turbines, onshore wind turbines, are the second most effective intervention because you can actually generate electricity cheaper with onshore wind turbines than you can with coal plants and natural gas plants. And so you can see, interestingly, we think about carbon as being mostly industrial, but educating girls and family planning in developing nations are two of the topmost interventions, and that's because you reduce family size, you reduce demand on resources, and you're able to improve, to reduce carbon emissions. And so you can Google this and look at the list. It's pretty interesting to read about and go through the 100 ones. Rooftop solar is an interesting one because we think of power as being generated by large centralized power stations. And so when we think of solutions, we think, what's going to replace this large coal plant in Huntington, Utah, or this large coal plant up in Wyoming? And that's sort of 20th century thinking, because now we can generate electricity with a distributed system like rooftop solar in many different places. We don't really have to generate all of our electricity in one big place. The challenge with that is all the transmission lines are geared towards those large systems, and so you have to sort of be able to redirect the transmission. And our transmission lines are not really organized very efficiently. We don't have grid integration, so there's transmission grids that have excess power that they're just dumping, and transmission grids that need power that they are trying to buy off the market. And so national grid integration is a really important part of this because it allows both reduction in wasted power and the ability for distributed generation to work. So as we talk about replacing our existing technology, this is a chart I thought was interesting because it shows kind of the life cycle of different things that we use. So if we're going to ask people to get rid of their gas-powered car and buy a hybrid electric or a plug-in hybrid or something, a light-duty vehicle has a lifespan of about 15 years. So that's how long it takes to turn that stuff over from the more polluting technology to less polluting technology. And you can see buildings have about this says 35, it's probably longer than that, about a 40-year life cycle. And so a building like this that wasn't built during an era when climate change was a concern, and many, many buildings, including the ones most of us live in, that's a whole different life cycle turnover. So as we think about what we can do, we need to think about what we can do quickly because of those RCP curves and how quickly things could deteriorate if we don't. So what can we do as individuals? There's some stuff that's sort of been around for a long time that we don't think of as being related to climate change, and one is the Energy Star program. So when you buy a refrigerator, or when we buy a washing machine, or when we buy windows for our house, they all have the potential to have an Energy Star rating. And there's 60,000 products who have this rating, and about 3,000 that are the most efficient. And it's a big market with a lot of jobs related to it. And it ranges from light bulbs all the way to windows and insulation. And so you can see here, oh, my arrows got off in the you can see that we've saved 3 million tons of greenhouse gases by the certification of residential Energy Star. And in commercial, there's a portfolio manager. We've saved 110 million tons of greenhouse gases and 40 million from industrial. So that was just in 2017. So Energy Star, when we go shopping, that we need to have that in our mind. What is the Energy Star rating of the product I'm about to buy, rather than does it look nice in my kitchen? I mean, in addition to, does it look nice in my kitchen? You know, does it fit the space? That's a really important part of it. And it's inconsistent whether when you go into a retail establishment, whether the salesman will know. So the consumer has to be asking for it. And the more we ask for it, the more they'll say, I keep getting asked about this. We need to stock more of this product. And that's kind of the way that we individually can have an impact on this. And then the other one is automobile ratings. And so most people know that automobiles have smog ratings, but there's also a greenhouse gas rating, and they're different. So the greenhouse gas rating is based on the emissions of greenhouse gases, which are in the top part of that list, and the smog rating is based on the emissions of antecedents to particulates. So volatile organic compounds, nitrous oxides, and carbon monoxide chemically react in the air to form small particulates that get down in our alveoli. So the smog rating of a car might be one thing, and the greenhouse gas rating of a car might be another thing. And this is required to be posted on every car, new car that's sold. And we've actually gone and done this. Almost no car salesman, if you ask them what the greenhouse gas rating of the car you're looking at, will know what it is. Some of them don't even know where to look to find it. So again, it has to be a consumer-driven change that gets this to be more prominent when we go to buy a car. That's one of the first things we ask is, what is the greenhouse gas rating of this automobile? So some people say, yeah, the emissions is great, but what about the total carbon footprint of a vehicle? So there's the manufacturing. If you have an electric car, there's whatever's generating the electricity. There's the batteries and the production and disposal of batteries. And so there's a total carbon footprint that is larger, different than just the emission greenhouse gas footprint. And this is just greenercars.org has a list of where they rate cars based on the total carbon footprint of the car. And the best cars, of course, are cars we can't afford, but it goes all the way down. And you can actually go to this site and look at your car and see what the rating of your car is. Or if you're thinking of buying a car, you can go in and say, what's the rating of this Subaru Outback or whatever it is you're looking at, and you can start making your purchasing decisions based on this data. So this question about whether electric vehicles really are better because of if they are run off electricity and electricity is getting produced by a coal plant down in Huntington, Utah, are we really doing anything better? And this was a study that was published in Forbes. So the blue shows, well, let me go up. The tailpipe is the gray. And this is an average European car and a Toyota Prius hybrid. Because Toyota Priuses have emissions because the gas charges the battery. And then this shows a Nissan Leaf in different countries, and the carbon footprint is different because the fuel cycle is different. So in a country that has a lot of renewables, the carbon footprint of that Nissan Leaf is going to be smaller. In a country that has a lot of coal plants, the carbon footprint is going to be bigger. But no matter what country you lived in, the Nissan Leaf was at least as carbon neutral or low carbon as a Toyota Prius, much lower carbon than the average car. And in some countries, the Leaf was much, much lower. So the blue is the manufacturing carbon emissions, and then the light blue is the battery related carbon emissions. So the conclusion in Forbes was that even though there are these other carbon outputs from making electric vehicles, they still have a lower carbon footprint than your average gasoline vehicle. So what can physicians or other health providers do? Well, there's mygreendoctor.org, and you don't have to be a doctor. You can be a nurse or a therapist or anything else. If you work in an office or you work in a hospital, these are the components that your facility can start focusing on. And more organizations are developing sustainability offices, sustainability advisory councils. And the University of Utah has a sustainability office that focuses on this stuff. And the challenge at the University of Utah, because the chairman of our board used to be the director of sustainability at the university, just retired in October, is that while that sustainability office does great things, there still isn't integration at the university between parking services, for example, and the sustainability office and building management. So they can do so much, the sustainability office, but if parking services says we need to build more parking lots, and sustainability says we need to discourage people from driving their cars to campus, we need to build less parking lots, there's this tension. And so those are the kind of things that are happening not only here, but in Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County. They have sustainability offices, and you can see their cars idling for long periods of time, or wasting water during stormy periods or whatever. So there's this lack of integration consideration that the people who work in those places need to sort of let their employers know that this is really important to me to work in a place that pays attention to this. In terms of education, there's not enough time in patient visits to talk about everything. And so it's easy to say, you should talk to your patients about climate change during the visit. And you go like, right, when am I going to do that? So, but on the other hand, healthcare providers are among the most trusted, most influential sources of information that people have. And so there's this, how do we take advantage of that? You can go to the American College of Physicians website, and this is a 2-page fact sheet, front and back. Leave it in your waiting room, leave it in your exam rooms. You don't have to say anything. The fact that you have it out is telling the patients, this is important to me. And then the other thing is when you're talking, this is a really hard thing to have a conversation about because you don't know, maybe this person doesn't believe in climate change, or maybe they think I'm ranting. And so there are ways that you can, it's important to have this conversation because we're not talking about it enough with our kids, with our friends, with our colleagues. And so one way that's been suggested to do this is say, you know, I'm kind of worried about what my grandkids' future is going to be like. This climate change thing has me kind of worried. Are you worried about it? And just sort of don't say, I need to tell you about climate change and you need to go buy an electric vehicle. I mean, that, like, but I mean, just start engaging people and say, what are you worried about? What part of this are you worried about? And if they know that something you're thinking about, and it's not as threatening to sort of say, let's have a conversation about this. I need to understand what other people are thinking. I feel kind of alone in this. That's a way to get the things going. It's amazing how many times in a grocery store you'll be standing in line and someone will say, well, my doctor told me. And you hear this all the time. People really trust what their healthcare providers tell them. And so whether it's with your patients or with your colleagues, your families and friends, it's important to sort of think about how to have this conversation. So let's move on to Rocky Mountain Power, which is the major electricity supplier in our area. Now, we do a lot of work with them trying to move them toward the future. So this shows their service area. It's actually Pacific Core. Rocky Mountain Power is the Utah part of it. Pacific Core is their parent company, and this shows their network. And so you can see where their coal facilities are with the yellow dots, and I won't go through it all. And about 56% of their electricity generation is from coal. But the problem with that is that Oregon, California, and Washington have all passed ordinances saying we will no longer pay for coal after 2025. I think it's 2025, yeah. So in Utah, the electricity sources for us is 77% coal because a lot of those hydro, wind, and stuff are going to those other states. Pacific Core is starting to wean those states off of coal. And so our coal allocation keeps going up. So Rocky Mountain Power does an Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, it's a 20-year plan, but they revise it every 2 years based on what the market's doing, what the prices are doing, what the demand is. And they just announced in October, earlier or this month, that they intend to close 83% of their coal units by 2038. Well, those coal units are in plants and not all of them generate the same amount of power, so they're going to close the least efficient, least productive ones. And because they have to wean Oregon, Washington, California off coal, our rates could be paying for more coal in Utah because they're shifting their coal allocation, more of the coal allocation to us because Utah doesn't have a provision, a policy like this. So it's one of the things that we try to push Rocky Mountain Power on all the time. They're a business. They have a business model. They need to make money. They can't lose money. They have an obligation through the Public Service Commission not to raise our rates any higher than are necessary. They have to present to the Public Service Commission and said, here's the rates if we used all renewables, and here's the rates if we use coal. And the Public Service Commission's job is not to save the environment. It's to get us the lowest electricity rates they can get us. They're there to protect our pocketbooks. So there's this sort of perverse incentive around moving the power system forward this way. Well, the thing that sort of helped is that because we are withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, and because some states like Utah aren't willing to pass renewable energy goals, it's moved down the chain to counties and cities. And so right now, there's 141 cities and towns that have passed 100% renewable energy goals. 6 of them have already at, they're small towns, but they've already achieved the 100%. So about 20% of the nation already lives in a community where their government has said we're going to be carbon free by, or totally renewable by some date in the future. So these are the communities in Utah so far that have passed these ordinances. And if you live in a town that hasn't, the language is already written, the political part of it. The Sierra Club has a major program to work just on this, just on getting communities to pass 100% renewable ordinances. And this has started in many of these places like Holiday and Cottonwood Heights by a small group of citizens that said we want our town to be part of this. Last year in the legislature, the problem with this is in order to do this, they have to be relieved of the Public Service Commission requirement to charge the lowest possible rate. So if you live in one of these cities, you may pay a bit of a higher rate for your power in order to get renewable. Now over time it'll come down, but it'll be higher in the beginning, and then over time as renewables get more and more common, and the technology to sort of fill in the gaps of renewables gets cheaper, the rates will come down. But it's a commitment, and the legislature authorized the Public Service Commission to create a new rate structure for communities that want to achieve 100% renewable. So even though our legislature will not pass statewide renewable goals, they have recognized the justification of cities who want to do this, which is good because a lot of times the legislature, if they see cities doing things they don't like, they say you can't do that. This one, they actually are enabling them to do it. 2 years ago, we were involved in a concurrent resolution that was passed in the legislature on environmental and economic stewardship. This was started by some students in Logan that came down the year before at the end of the session, said we want this resolution introduced to the legislature. The legislator said it's too late, you're too late. But one legislator, Becky Edwards from Bountiful, a Republican, said let's throw it in the hopper, see what happens. So she introduced it into committee, there was a discussion, they got going, they refined it over the summer, they introduced it to the next legislative session. And I won't read through what it does. It's really funny because it had climate change in it, and a bunch of Republicans say you can't say climate change, but we'll accept it if you say changing climate. These are the sort of political sort of silliness that goes on. But we're so fine, we'll put changing climate, whatever will make you vote for it. And it's symbolic mostly. It doesn't have any teeth that makes anyone do anything, but it's the first dominant Republican state that has passed a resolution acknowledging the existence of climate change and saying our policy is going to be guided by the potential to do something about this. And they acknowledge the impacts on rural communities of losing jobs, and they acknowledge that Utah could be a leader in technology and all that stuff that they needed to have in there. But this was important because now when we go back and say, well, we'd like to do this other thing, they say, and we say, remember the resolution that we committed to this? It allows us to have that conversation. You know how dominated the conservatives are in the Utah legislature. Well, it passed the House 51-21 with 3 abstaining, and it passed the Senate 23-3. So it wasn't like just by the neck of the skin of our teeth. It had broad support, and people like Mike Noel, who you would never think would vote for it, voted for it, and it was because of the relationships he had with the sponsor. This is going to be the most wonky, complicated, mind-numbing slide that I'll talk about. So bear with me. Rocky Mountain Power has all these coal power plants that they took out loans on, and they, just like your mortgage, they said, we're going to pay this off over the next 40 years. And just like your mortgage, if you can pay it off and keep living in your home, those are years that you don't have to pay a mortgage and you get to live in your home. Well, Rocky Mountain Power has power plants that they're paying down, and they want to extend the livelihood of those plants as long as they can because they've already spent the money. So to shut down those coal plants now creates what in the business world is called a stranded asset. Stranded asset is something that you've paid for, it's worth something, but you're not able to use it as part of your business plan anymore. So in the business world, there's a concept known as securitization and capital recycling. And this is where it gets really complicated. So the paying down of coal plants is an obligation that we as ratepayers have. That has to go in our power bill, that we're going to pay not only the loan, but the interest on that loan as part of our power bill on that coal plant. We pay that every month as part of our power bill. But the interest rate on those loans was like 12 to 15%. So we pay a lot of interest on those loans. So what you do, because we have an obligation to keep paying off those loans, you issue a bond and you say, we're going to issue a bond and we'll guarantee a 3% return on that bond. Remember, we're paying 10 to 12% interest right now. We'll guarantee a 3% interest on that bond because the ratepayers still have to pay the rest of that off. And that allows the bond money then goes back to to Rocky Mountain Power. They have this infusion of cash that they can then invest in new power sources, solar farms, wind farms. And that power is so much cheaper to generate because the operational costs are low, the fuel costs are low, that they can actually end up with extra money at the end of that process. This is an area of financing that I don't completely understand, but we have a bunch of economists who are saying this has been done before, it can work, really smart people. So we are going to introduce a bill in the legislature this year. We have a Republican sponsor that will allow Rocky Mountain Power to do this, which will allow them to retire their coal plants earlier than they currently are planned, without increasing rates and without impacting their shareholders. Not only that, but the modeling says there'll be several $1 million left over that you can invest in community transition. So places like Price and Helper that are totally coal dependent, they need to be able to transition out of those economies. Well, there'll be money left over in this process that will allow investments in those communities to transition their economy. So it's a win-win-win-win because the fourth win is we don't have carbon emissions anymore. And it sounds too good to be true, but we keep having people in banks and pension funds saying, yeah, we'd buy that bond. And so, and Rocky Mountain Power is not opposing it. Now, what we're not doing with this bill is calling it a coal retirement bill, because that's just going to create a flash reaction. And so we're just saying this is a tool that Rocky Mountain Power is going to be given to make them more nimble in the market as power sources change. We're trying not to say this is the bill that's going to let them retire coal plants, but this is the bill that's going to let them retire coal plants. But it also would give them a tool to do other things if they needed to. One of the things that's talked about a lot with wind and solar is that the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't blow all the time, and so there's this gap where you're not generating power, and how do we fill that gap? And that's why folks are saying, well, we need to keep our coal plants open because there isn't reliability. Well, there's a lot of things that you can do about reliability. There's grid integration that I talked about. There's demand management where the power company can actually lower the temperature in this building remotely when they need more power to send something else at night. If there's no one here, they'll just lower the temperature, or they'll manage the power. They can do that across the whole power sector. And if they have demand management capability, they can move the power where it needs. And then there's energy storage. So if you can take that excess, California has to give away solar power. They generate so much solar power during the day. Sometimes they have to pay people to take it. So if you can store that energy somehow and then pull it back out when you have these gaps, you can have reliability and continuity of the power system. So there's a whole bunch of different technologies for energy storage. Some of you have heard about this salt cavern out in the West Desert, where you use the excess energy in the day to pump gas into a cavern that contains it under pressure, and then you release that pressure when you need it, and it spins the turbines when you don't have power, and that sort of allows you. There's another one where you actually pump, when you have excess power during the day, you pump water up to the top of a hill with that excess power, and then when you need the power, you pull the water down through a hydro turbine and you generate power. So those are sort of some interesting technologies. The most common one is solid state batteries. They're getting better and better, and this just shows the increase in capacity of solid state batteries, most of which are lithium-ion batteries, that's happened over the last several years. It's like wind and solar, that people initially thought this will never be cheap enough to use, that it can't be adopted fast enough, and the wind and solar capacity has exceeded the projections every single year for the last 20 years. So residential scale, we can all have a battery in our house, so we can generate power off our roof and store it and pull it back out when we need it. And this is what's happened to residential energy storage deployments over the last 5-10 years. This is an issue of some contention at HEAL. This is our position. We don't think nuclear power is a necessary part of addressing climate change. The nuclear industry is really strongly proposing that it is. And some environmental organizations are saying we have to accept this as part of the solution. Others are saying we don't. So you should do your own research about this and say, which side do I believe? Our reasons for saying that it's not our main reason for saying that we don't like it is that it generates waste, which we don't know what to do with already. But that doesn't persuade a lot of people, and so the other reasons are that there's too long of a lag time from planning to operations. It takes 10 to 20 years from planning to get through the regulatory process at the NRC to actually build a plant to generate power. That's too long for us to try to rely on that to generate nuclear power. I don't know what that is.
Cancel that. Yeah.
Just say cancel?
Yeah, use the mouse and cancel. Sorry.
Okay. The cost is excessive. It doesn't generate power as cost effectively as wind and solar does. It generates the production of high-grade uranium ore and enrichment that creates a weapons proliferation risk. There's the Fukushima scenario, Chernobyl. The Chernobyl thing on HBO gave us more members than anything in the last couple of years. It scared everyone to death. And then the uranium fuel cycle isn't just about nuclear waste after the power is generated. The whole uranium fuel cycle, from mining to milling to enrichment, creates hazards, health hazards at every step of the way. And a lot of those hazards are visited on indigenous communities, and especially the Navajo Reservation has had a major impact from uranium mining. And then they have their own carbon equivalent emissions from all the production issues, and batteries and hydropower can ramp up much faster for reliability than nuclear power plants can. So I'm biased. I've done my own research, but you'll talk to people who will say, no, we do need this, and you should, like I said, decide for yourself. Just going to really quickly, there's major issues related to climate change on land use solutions. So cover crops, the preservation of tropical forests, you've all heard about that. Increasing desertification of the globe, where more and more land is barren. and fugitive dust that blows off barren land that lands on the snow and keeps and warms up in the winter. It doesn't reflect the heat as much. We waste a lot of food, and that is an inefficient use of the land. And so this isn't going to just reverse by itself. If we just say, well, let's stop doing all this stuff, there has to be an active process to renew the land, and it has to be at a fairly major scale if we're going to use that carbon capture that the land can do to help us with this problem. So the fossil fuel industry says, well, we can just capture all that carbon that comes out of our smokestacks, and so it won't go in the atmosphere. And the idea is that you capture it with either absorption or absorption. The most common one is absorption with amines. It has a chemical reaction. You put it in a pipeline or in ships. You move it to someplace where you can store it, and you can either then break it down or convert it to something else. And this is all very new, experimental. There's a few of these that are being piloted around the globe. But there's a lot of environmental groups that are opposed to this because it's basically the fossil fuel industry saying we want to keep mining coal and drilling for oil and keep using it, and we just have better alternatives for power. But you'll hear about this as people talk about climate change. So this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. Carbon Dividend Act, Energy Innovation. So this is a bill that's been introduced in the House. It was introduced last year. It was introduced this year. And the idea is that it's kind of the cap and trade thing I talked about with sulfur. It's a little bit different. You put a price on carbon, and you increase it every year, and you create these credits and fees that people can, that the carbon industry, the carbon emitters can trade. But the difference of this in terms of is that 100% of the proceeds of this, of the fees that are collected from carbon polluters, would go back into our pockets. So none of the money stays at the government except what's needed to administer the program, and then every citizen gets a dividend. And for the average family of four, there's 3,500 economists who have supported this, so it's pretty solid economically. For an average family of four, that dividend would be about $3,500 a year. And the idea is that as the polluters' prices go up at the gas pump or at your electricity bill, this allows your average citizen to be able to absorb those increased costs of living until we get to a point where it's cheaper to not generate carbon emissions than it is to generate them, and then the dividends start going down, but the cost of living goes down. There's a border adjustment so that you can't create stuff across the border and then bring it in that isn't subject to this tax, and you can't offshore your jobs, and if you're going to emit carbon in another country, you still have to pay this. And the controversial thing is that it pauses the EPA's authority to regulate CO2. And the reason is they want to do what the sulfur dioxide did and let the market work and see if this can bring things down. The projections are that it would reduce carbon emissions by 40% over the first 12 years that it was in implementation. Create new jobs, reduce deaths, pollution-related deaths. And there is some bipartisan support. Of the 68 sponsors, there's one Republican. So bipartisan is sort of a euphemism, I think, for this. Another version of this is the Climate Leadership Councils. George Shultz and James Baker, who were former officials in Republican administrations, have proposed this same idea. The one difference, one of the main differences is that their proposal says that the fossil fuel industry would be immune from lawsuits of any effects of climate change, and that's not a part of HR 763. And so that's going to be one of the things you'll hear go back and forth as this moves through. This is probably the most important piece of legislation related to climate change that has a possibility of passing right now. So the last thing, Mitt. So Mitt was focused on climate change while he was the governor of Massachusetts. They had a major climate change plan when he was there. Then when he ran for president, he reversed his position. I'm sure because his consultants told him that in the primary, the base wouldn't vote for him if he talked about climate change. But now that he's not running for president and that he's a senator with assured re-election from a state, he's feeling emboldened to talk about many things, and this is one of them. He's made many public statements saying he believes climate change is real and that humans are part of the cause. He does have his own sort of reservations about whether it's urgent enough to threaten the economy by doing anything. And he also says that India and China are the main problems. Well, I showed you those charts before, that they are and they aren't. And he just last week announced, or earlier this week, I think, announced that he was going to join the Senate bipartisan climate caucus. So Mitt needs to hear from all of us that we support this. And he needs to know that no matter what your party affiliation is, that we support this. Back on the table, there's postcards that I've brought that you can sign, and you can give them to me, or you can put a stamp on them, and they'll go to Mitt Romney and say, thank you for speaking up for climate change. We are behind you, and we want you to continue. So if there's only one thing that you do after you've heard me talk, I would suggest you send Mitt Romney a postcard, because we need him to know that he's speaking for Utahns. So thanks.
We have a question here from a previous speaker.
Hi. Yes. I want to know what you can tell me about the Blue Sky program a little bit, if you can comment on that.
Well, the Blue Sky program is well-intended, but it purchases credits from other sources, and it hasn't resulted in Rocky Mountain Power reducing their own coal production at all. So on the one hand, it's a good marketing tool. It gets everyone aware of renewable energy. But in terms of changing Rocky Mountain Power's business model, it hasn't really done anything to reduce their coal power plant emissions.
So you talked about the replacing hydrofluorocarbons as refrigerants. What are they going to replace it with? And isn't there just an inherent problem with a refrigerant that's designed to absorb heat?
Now you've exceeded my knowledge of refrigerants. I'm sorry, but I know in the Kigali Accord amendment, the details of that, there are refrigerants that when they replaced the chlorofluorocarbons with hydrofluorocarbons, they didn't know, they thought they were solving a problem. They didn't know they were creating a new problem. So there's no guarantee that the next refrigerant won't create a different problem. But we can only do what we know how to do, right? So there are other refrigerants. I'm not that familiar. The most important thing about both chlorofluorocarbons and fluorocarbons is the management of them when they're being produced and infused into the coils and removed from the coils. So that's when they off gas and create problems. When they're in the coils, doing their job, they don't have a problem. It's the pre and post. And so when he talks about refrigerant management, they're talking about the way of decommissioning, of producing refrigerants and decommissioning cooling units that prevent those chemicals from being released to the atmosphere. That's as important as changing what's in the actual cooling coils themselves.
This was an excellent presentation, and thank you very much. How do we get this information to people with their heads in the sand?
Well, I decided to come work at Heal Utah because You just have to talk louder than they do. I mean, there's some people that will never be convinced, and you just can't waste your time. But there's a lot of people who, like I said, if they hear someone they know and trust, and not lecture to them, but say, this is starting to really worry me. And if you connect it to, like I do, I talk about I exploit my grandkids every day, saying, I'm really worried. My youngest grandchild, who was born in June, when she's my age, it will be 2085. So think about, what is her life going to be like in 2085 if we don't do something? It could be intolerable. And so I just try to use that as I'm doing this because I'm worried about my grandkids, and I think, like I said, just talk about it, because I think there's a lot of people who are on the fence and they just haven't heard it enough. They hear the sound bites from the news or they hear the debate in Congress, but they haven't heard, and they're suspicious of experts, but they haven't heard it enough from people who they trust. And we just need to talk about it. And some people are going to say, you're crazy. You just shrug and go on. Sorry, I wish I had a better answer.
Thank you. This is kind of a follow-up to that question. I think that there's a lot of people who care about climate change but are under the impression that you have to choose between protecting the environment or having a functioning economy. And I think that's something that I would like to know more about, is how to address that concern. Because I believe that you can do both. I don't believe you have to choose, but I don't really have the studies or anything to back that up. So I don't know if you have any information about that.
That's a really good question, and I didn't drill into that stuff for this presentation. It's pretty complicated because there's issues of, there's coal mine jobs and coal power plant jobs, and then there's solar and wind jobs. Well, it doesn't take nearly as many people to run a solar farm as it does to run a coal plant. And the pay for doing rooftop solar installations isn't nearly as good as it is for going down in a coal mine. And so there's been a lot of transitions. I mean, what happened to the typewriter industry, for heaven's sakes? So the economy is always transitioning, and I think the biggest problem is the level playing field. So coal and oil and natural gas have such a stronghold on the subsidies, on federal subsidies, that it's hard for wind and not just subsidies, but just coal has control of all the transmission lines. Well, you can't get your power onto the transmission line unless Rocky Mountain Power lets you put it on there. So there's all sorts of impediments. But if you look just at the economy in terms of production, there's more people employed in the solar industry now than there are in the coal industry. And some of those jobs are good paying, some of them aren't. But the total economic impact, I think, the price of electricity is going to go down. So that's going to put more money into the economy. And if you look at the slide on the Dividend Act, it creates 2.1 million new jobs. Just that $3,500 infusion into everyone's pocket stimulates the economy, and it creates new jobs. The economy is going to change, and where you can live is probably going to change. There aren't going to be as many jobs in Price, Utah as there are now. People are going to have to change, but we're all going to change if the planet implodes, right? So you're right, it's a hard conversation. There is data out there, and I can try to find more of it for you. Yeah. Great.
Okay, well, let's thank you, Scott, for his wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.